Before I begin, I want us to take a moment to show my appreciation for all the work that is required to put on an event like the Barkley Forum for high schools. To be totally transparent, this introduction might be a tad long because there are several individuals, institutions, and special moments that are specific to this season of Lincoln Douglas debate on the national circuit that are worth celebrating when one gets the opportunity. Specifically, I would like to thank the Barkley Forum Foundation for their support for the celebration of the community that is Barkley Forum for high schools. No other forensic event in America cares for high school teachers and competitions the way the Barkley Forum for high schools does. I would like to thank my parents for their unconditional and overwhelming encouragement despite not understanding most of what goes on here, Elijah Smith and Bennett Eckert for their support from two opposite sides of the world, Brian Mahir and Anais for being the best teammates I could ask for, Rodrigo, Chris Randall, DeMarcus Powell, and Aaron Timmons for their endless wisdom, experience, and support. I'm lucky to have been taught by a group of people who challenged the way that I looked at the world. In addition, the Lincoln Douglas Tab Room, headed by Eric Mathis and Chris Palmer, as well as the Emory debaters for guiding the Lincoln Douglas division. I also wanted to take a moment to express my congratulations to the new key coaches for the Barkley Forum for high schools. Mr. Adam Jacoby from Wisconsin, Mr. Josh Clark, Montgomery Bell Academy, Mr. Roger Leon, Superintendent of the Newark School System, Ms. Harriet Medlin, Brentwood, Mr. Bob Schertz, Hawkins School. And I also wanted to give a shout out to all the women who have rocked to the late elims and final rounds of major national invitationals. Debate like a girl.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to reflect on what it means to be in finals reading the AF I'm about to read. Over my time in debate, my coaches have instilled in me the importance of speaking from my social location, and I never really felt like a topic allowed me to do that until this one was announced. When I heard the topic, I knew I wanted to speak out about Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people. After closing out a tournament last winter reading this AF, a prominent debate camp published an article on Facebook imploring debaters to stop reading this AF in debates. It's an honor to be here today, and I'm proud to continue speaking the truth about a modern-day tragedy. No matter what happens, my conversation will not be shut down. Finally, a shout out to our friends from St. Andrews. Eshawn and Mr. Shields, you are a testament to a wicked, sharp, hardworking, and talented debate program can accomplish. It has been truly great competing against you these past few years, and I look forward to the rest of the year. Now, let's get the round started. The 1AC is set. Is everybody ready? The United States and Israel are connected by a shared history of land-based dispossession. You should call into question any narrative that represents the U.S.'s unconditional donation of aid as anything but a settler solidarity. Saraski 15. The special relationship between Israel and the United States is rooted in our founding mythology. Settler colonialism is the right for them to understand Israel and Palestine as well as the U.S. It helps us understand why Americans so easily accept the dominant Israeli narrative. We've been primed by our own white supremacy. No other country in the world has been the recipient of more military aid from the U.S. The key to ending Israel's ongoing occupation of Palestinians is ending that unconditional special relationship. Understanding the roots of this relationship is not idle curiosity. It's essential if we are to ever achieve a just and durable peace for both peoples. We have a mythic and national narrative of two settler colonial peoples who both believe we have divine mandate to settle savagely and ethnic cleansing genocide are all divinely justified. The Zionist famous slogan, land with no people for a people with no land. Israel's miraculous military genocide via God takes hand. The fundamental root we've all like to call the Israel-Palestinian competence decision to practice what's the land with people. The process of colonization has stopped. And military aid emboldens Israel policy and creates threats, not stops them. Yackley and Zuno 5. U.S. assistance to Israel has enabled Israel to pursue aggressive policies. The use of U.S. weapons against civilian targets is a violation of human rights standards. Military aid to Israel has increased violence. American assistance is emerging as a showing to policy that uses the resolution while boosting in military aid to Israel. The military aid has been used in widespread killings of civilians, destruction of infrastructure, and Palestinian societies and horror of Arab attitudes towards Israel. And U.S. military aid facilitates ethnic cleansing and props up the ongoing genocide of indigenous Palestinian populations. Morris 18. The Israeli government continues to enforce restrictions on Palestinian human rights, restrict the movement of people, and facilitate their transfer of Israeli citizens to settlement. Israel assumes no responsibility. Israel treats the West Bank as if we're part of a sovereign territory, grabbing land, exploiting natural resources, building permanent settlements. Palestinian West Bank has been living under rigid military rule that serves Israeli settlers. Palestinians were confronted with the tense attacks, the enormous destruction of infrastructure. Israel justifies its excursion. The two-state solutions. The U.S. officially stops it, but its actions support for Israel opposes it. The U.S. supplies Israel with most of its weapons and military hardware through foreign aid. Washington's military aid to Israel includes everything. Israel then uses weapons to kill Palestinian civilians. The oppression of Palestinians by Israel in the United States has long been one of the driving recruitment to jihadist groups. And the pro-Israel lobby is strong, but now is the time to speak up. Alexander Owen 1. Congress has remained silent on the human rights nightmare. Israel's political lobby holds well-documented power. Organizations have remained silent as well. Students or people expressing support for Palestinians because of McCarthy tactics and secret organizations. King's teaching requires us to speak out passionately. We must not be memorized by uncertainty, unrelenting violations of international law, continued occupation of the West Bank, home demolitions, land confiscation, the treatment of Palestinians at checkpoints, routine searches of their homes, restrictions of their movements, limited to decent housing. We must not tolerate Israel's refusal to discuss the rights of refugees. We ought to question the U.S. government funds the support of multiple hostilities, civilian casualties in Gaza. $38 billion the U.S. has pledged. We must speak out against the system of legal discrimination. And every token of support for Israel plays a part in a global regime of genocide, of brutality, and reveals how settler colonialism and anti-blackness overlap to create the judicial slaughter of disposed communities. Understanding the two genocides as parallel broadens the struggle for liberation. When you vote AF, you are taking a leap of faith against the Israeli state. You should refuse to provide Israel with anything and any tools that permit the structure of violence to continue. Ashton Moore 14. Black Americans and Palestinians are exacerbated by the interlinked process of Zionism and militarism. For every additional form of abuse support for Israeli regimes or opportunity communities are more pronounced or abridged by shared conditions of colonialism. Ministers in the United States, Jim Crow American apartheid provide parallel histories, and Black Arabs become legible as what these binaries become described narratives of reciprocal solidarity. The Black and our human or humanized. Reciprocal mainly the mentions between our communities, mostly expressing his reflections as boycott, like provides some experimental theoretical resource for the renewal of certain effective sociality. When anti-blackwashing work in tandem with one another, we marched up closer, new international insurgent feeling. June Jordan writes, I was born a Black woman, now I become a Palestinian. We derive further strength across our divides together. Palestinians and Israel and our friend and overcrowded are considered the sites of poverty, crime, under-resourced schools constitute political context, racialized structure, urban class that mirrors the one that finds in inner city America today. Criminalities based on death would bring true as well as the best black subject in the inner city of the United States. Our interconnected struggles are counted by African Americans and Palestinians go on reason not to say the Palestinian struggle is a black struggle highlights the importance of remaining vigilant about the inappropriation of another community struggle. Plan. The United States ought not provide military aid to Israeli authoritarian regimes. To clarify, that we defend any all forms of aid in every mechanism possible. Union 16. How can the Palestinians defend themselves against one's advanced military when Israel deliberately turns up its electricity to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians as punishment for joining the International Criminal Court? You don't need fifth-generation cell technology to blow up civilian houses in the Gaza Strip. It's time for the United States to drop its military support for Israel now. This is a relationship strictly behind American hegemonic and geopolitical interests, and it's literally killing people. The only way this will become possible is the government stops endorsement of Israel's actions. And Netanyahu's regime is not unique. Authoritarianism is written into the structure of the Israeli government. Jelani 15. Israel is not a victim of late right-wing wave. Its population is deeply authoritarian. The 4.5 million Palestinians having lived as controlled by Israeli military had no vote in yesterday's election. Few Israelis dare to oppose Netanyahu's policy. This is not a behavior of liberal democracy. The Senate produced emergent authoritarianism. And Netanyahu is not a bug in Israel. He is a feature. But keeping millions of Palestinians under military rule, American politicians, civil society organizations, thought leaders are all denying morality, but these statements have in common that a single one is calling for these to shift the actual policy is not threatened to freeze it to Israel. And Israel relies on the U.S. There is no substitute for U.S. military. Farley 17. Termination would impact Israel's defense posture. Israel's reliance on the U.S. is critical. None of the other main arms producers today could replace the U.S. None would be willing to provide the funding. The U.S. is committed by statute to preserving Israel's military aid. Israel enjoys the de facto U.S. security which may prove with the U.S. has pre-produced a large store of weapons in Israel, and the two countries engage in a wide variety of counterterrorism, homeland security, and counterproliferation, which is critical for Israel. And narratives of the necessary evil of the state of Israel are self-serving. Don't let the one and see hold you hostage. 0 for 12. In a chilling statement by Netanyahu, the weak crumble, the strong respected, the peace is made with the strong. Netanyahu's mainstream and fascist rhetoric, the makings of supposed necessary evil against supposed ultimate evil. I ran this kind of thinking is compatible with Zionism. Debating with Boris says the circumstances of history justify ethnic cleansing. It is important to avoid being led to think that Netanyahu Zionism did grow from colonial anachronism with the increasing rise of right-wing leaders. These fashions seem to survive with little connovation. Fascists rejoice in the rejection of political correctness. Opposition to such ideology is always discouraged. They see themselves as respected together with Netanyahu is forever lived by the sword. This smart nature of Zionism. Thus, the role of the ballot is to endorse the best methodology for the oppressed. This framework is not exclusive, but encourages comparison across space and time. Holding different understandings of violence together allows us to better understand colonial logic and avoid moral tunnel vision that created Israel in the first place. Saraski. Early European Zionists found themselves several. They believed the only solution to violence was for Jews to have a state of their own, but all genocides and acts of violence have their main features. They must be said and understood. The Holocaust did not mark the sudden inexplicable birth of white European capacity to commit genocide. No one notices that the indigenous people is common with sense of enslaved Africans. There's a tendency to also remove the history of Israel and Palestine from broader historical context and to see it as beyond time. We create a circular firing range and only become the agents of what we should be fighting against. Understanding our struggles as connected is so powerful. People chant Israel's racist state without a hint of self-irony or self-protection. One is literally standing on land built by slavery and the genocide of indigenous Americans. And the response from the academic community to proposal to cease military aid inevitably includes the following. But Israel needs defensive weapons from the United States for self-protection, for cybersecurity, for missile defense. Israel needs military aid for the fundamental question is from whom. The unconscious discomfort with the death and destruction of black and brown bodies is the heart of the ability to ignore genocide abroad. Hiding behind implausible scenarios while their genocide against Palestinians is ignored. Flores. Debate has a race problem, race, the impact of race. Race is a secondary factor. There is plenty of evidence to illustrate that it's insufficient. Their lives across the border escape violence partially been caused by the United States spinning scream for immediate deportation. It's still a mainstream argument. Nobody in Gaza disperses over Greek because they're all potential terrorists. Societies open the debate to the value of black and brown bodies, whether they pose a threat to white communities. It's not possible to understand the root cause of our problems. Any activist that seeks to worry in solidarity must offer explicit critique of disposability of black and brown body safety has been used to justify the murder. And the AF defense military aid is the following, all in 94. Military aid is commonly used in transactions between the donor and recipient countries in form of grant aid, credit or cash, military aid hardware, weapons, lending equipment, training personnel, building of military infrastructure, and communication facilities.
Market facilities?
Yeah.
Okay. Is everybody ready for cross-examination? Should Israel exist?
The one AC will defend that Israel as a nation state is illegitimate, but Israelis does have a right to life, and the Jewish nation state deserves to live, just not in the current form that it has.
Just not where it is?
Not where it is, and not propped up by European intervening powers in an area of the world.
Where would people go if Israel, like, geographically, if Israelis had to geographically leave where they are?
Well, two arguments. One, the AF doesn't mandate that Israelis have to leave Israel, but rather the Palestinians should have sovereignty, which means it's a question of reorganization from that point. The second point here is that after World War II, when discussing where Israel should be, they tossed around multiple ideas, i.e. some people suggested that Israel should be in Madagascar. This proves that there are still different options about where Israel should be and also answers that argument.
Okay, that makes sense. I have a question about the sort of holding hostage argument.
Sure.
Is any interaction with Israel in the international sphere Israel holding everyone hostage?
Not any interaction, but rather trying to justify Israel as some sort of necessary evil or necessary outgrowth because worse things would happen mirrors the way that we sort of continually invest in Israel in the status quo and prevents us from really questioning whether or not it should exist.
I understand. The evidence seems to be talking about specific conservative members of the United States federal government. Does it only apply to them, or does it apply to any justification for
Well, you should
military
look
aid
to
to
the uniqueness
Israel?
question also in the affirmative that talks about how the pro-Israel lobby is strong now, which creates incentives for the United States to continue an investment in Israel and doesn't allow for the sort of questioning or interrogation of what's really going on.
Does the affirmative have to prove that the plan is a good idea, or is the questioning/interrogation part of the affirmative an independent reason to prefer?
The plan is a good idea, but the questioning is still valuable to the process.
It's valuable to the process, but you will still have to prove that the plan is a good idea?
The questioning proves that the plan is a good idea, i.e. you'll vote out because the plan is a good idea.
I actually want to ask a hypothetical about that. Let's say the plan happens to be a little bit worse than some negative advocacy, but the affirmative has engaged more properly in this questioning process. How does the judge decide
So
to debate
I feel
them?
like you're setting up a pick argument or some sort of counterplan. It's a question of how you orient yourself to Israel, i.e. can you stop endorsing Israel's actions insofar as you still pledge alliance or choose to recognize its right to exist?
Okay, does the United States only have military relations with Israel?
So the argument is that military aid to Israel is unique and is a unique form of aid for two reasons. One, because it affords Israel international capital and allows them to pursue aggressive policies because of a strict military blanket and security
If I
technologies.
may interrupt, these sound like material reasons why the military aid is bad, not symbolic or like sort of ethics-based ones?
Not necessarily. The first point you interrupted me and did not let me finish, but it's also a question of the way that they're offensively postured in the region, which means that it's not a question of just the material weapons, but rather what does it justify that we are funneling lots of military aid into a country and empowering them with the right to defend themselves.
Okay.
The second
Sorry, go ahead.
The second reason as to why military aid is key is because the 1AC makes a claim that it is that it is specifically military aid from the United States that enables things like the ethnic cleansing and genocide and protecting illegal settlements, which is the reason as to why getting their military aid is still a good idea.
Okay. Before I begin, I also have some people to thank for a tournament like this. First, I would like to thank the directors of the Barkley Forum for putting together such an amazing event. It is a privilege to be here and to be debating. Second, I would like to thank the tab room, people who run the tab room, and the members of the staff at this tournament for constantly putting together and making sure that the sort of tournament runs well and things are on time, decision times are excellent, and this is one of the best tournaments I've had an experience with. It was just extremely well run. Third, I would like to thank the panel for adjudicating debates and for every judge who has ever volunteered to adjudicate a debate or has ever fulfilled an obligation or stayed with just one more round to provide valuable feedback and knowledge to the debaters who chose to be here. I would like to thank my teachers and my administration for supporting debate and supporting me when I miss large chunks of school to do something that none of them understand and speak at incredibly high rates. I'd also like to thank my parents for similar reasons, but also for never letting me give up on debate, for always telling me to moderate myself or, take care of myself, but never letting me get out of the activity they knew I loved. And no matter what I was feeling at the time, they are the reason I'm still in this activity, and they've given me so much unconditional support, even when I've definitely not deserved it. I would also like to thank my coach, Mr. Shields. This all began with you as a chaperone on a middle school retreat. I was in band. I tried to play an instrument. It didn't really work out, but debate was really my thing, and I'm so glad you were that chaperone. I would also like to thank the people who have helped me at this tournament and helped me this year. Rafi, it's a pleasure working with you. You're the nicest person I've ever met on the circuit, and it's incredible that we get to work together this year. Rex, Tage, I love you guys. Y'all are incredible. It is baffling that y'all have one more year to go, and I cannot wait to see what happens from now. I would also like to end by thanking Greenhill and Anna. The coaches of Greenhill probably mean more to me than I mean to them. As when I began in debate, traditional debate, in Mississippi, no established circuit, it was the Greenhill coaches and the Greenhill debaters who my coach first introduced me to as the entrance into circuit debate. It was them that we idealized and looked up to freshman and sophomore year. It was them that we were able to interact with, their debate camp that we were able to attend and learn so much from, and it is an honor to stand next to them and be able to engage in debate. Anna in particular, it's always a blast. It's just so much fun. You're incredible, and it is an honor to debate someone like you. The 1 and C has been sent. The order is 3 off, and then the case. Is there an issue?
Just
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Are my judges ready? Let's begin the tutorials 1 and C. First off is the strikes disadvantage. Reducing Israeli aid causes strikes, prolif, and economic collapse. Metz 13. The Middle East region is part of the world where American re-entrenchment of narrowing the U.S. military capabilities could have extensive adverse effects. The region does not have a functioning method for preserving order without outside involvement. The U.S. gone, Tehran become more aggressive and encouraging the spread of nuclear weapons. The state of the region could raise increased pressure on Israel, leading to preemptive military strikes with another major war. The U.S. had a number of security objectives in the Middle East, protecting access to the region's petroleum, limiting humanitarian disaster, preventing prolif, limiting Al-Qaeda, sustaining the Americans and committed partners. Arguments that the U.S. can disengage, assume that petroleum exports would continue. Economic damage would cascade, inevitably affecting the U.S. Disengagement from the Middle East would entail significant risk for the United States. Aid to Israel is symbolic. They would obviously freak out after the plan. Lake 14. While it's true that aid to Israel represents more than half the total of the U.S. annual foreign budget financing, he pointed to how the United States spends considerably more money on stationing troops in, for example, Germany and other defense obligations. The most important element of U.S. aid is not the dollar figure, but what it represents politically. The aid is a message to the region about the U.S.-Israeli alliance. And Israeli strikes would cause extinction. Moscow in 12. If Israel doesn't strike at Iran's nuclear facilities and breaks out even a small-scale regional nuclear war, could produce as many direct fatalities as WW2 and disrupt the global climate with environmental effects that would be devastating. Israeli military attack will leave a war in the Middle East, more terrorism raised worldwide, laced with economic woes, while many countries are at a breaking point. A regional nuclear confrontation might be geographically constrained. The environmental impacts would be worldwide. The Atlantic would not buffer the fall. Clear and present danger of possible nuclear confrontation if Israel attacks Iran. The dissent does turn and outweigh the case. If they're not responsible for the effects of the plan, then obviously you have no reason to affirm whatsoever. It is the same logic that causes the violence of Israel, when you decided to make a decision without endorsing what it would materially do to the surrounding areas. If we win that the plan is a bad idea, then regardless of the framing or whatever ethics argument the two will inevitably go for, it is still a reason to vote negative. Next off. The United States ought to A, provide military aid for missile defense programs to Israeli authoritarian regimes, and B, cease all other military aid to Israeli authoritarian regimes. Military aid is key. Annual funding, tech support, parts, and manufacturing. U.S. involvement is also monitoring, which is another net benefit. It's a purely defensive missile system, which means there's no disadvantage. Sharp in 14. Iron Dome, in order to counter rockets, Israel's developed Iron Dome selective targeted system and radar designed to fire severe interceptors on incoming projectiles that pose threat to population centers. Israel requires between 10 to 15 Iron Dome batteries. The U.S. has provided over $704 million to Israel for Iron Dome batteries, interceptors, co-production costs, and general maintenance. U.S. and Israeli government signed co-production agreement will enable components of the Iron Dome to be manufactured in the United States. The National Defense Authorization Act requires the Missile Defense Agency to report to Congress on the implementation of the Iron Dome to prove the coordination, interoperability, integration of the capabilities. David Sling, Israel and the United States signed a project agreement to co-develop David Sling system. David Sling counter-launch rockets such as possessed by Hezbollah, as well as Syria. David Sling designed to intercept missiles. The Arrow and the Arrow 2. The Arrow is designed to counter short-range ballistic missiles. The United States just funded another half the annual cost. Missile defense is empirically successful at countering missile strikes against Israeli civilians. That's key to prevent innocent people from being killed. Franceman 18. Israel's first-time activation of David Sling was fired on July to counter a missile threat. It launched 2 incendiary receptors. Missiles had been fired by Syrian government with Iron Dome determined to be successful. An air missile used to down a Syrian surface air missile Lamarja. All the layers of advanced missile defense have been put to use. Sonar interceptor missiles used to hit-to-kill technology was designed to maneuver and strike an incoming target rather than detonate in proximity. David Sling includes an actively electronic scan array multi-mission radar which works to identify incoming threat. On May 20th, Iranian Grand Fajr rockets were fired at Israel from Syria and intercepted by Iron Dome. It was generated to counter Iranian Fajr and Fateh 110 and Syria's M1600 as well as Scud missiles. Hezbollah's rockets have fallen into Israel with impunity in 2006. Iron Dome is effective. Recent tests prove that they're key for mortar rocket disruption. Gross 18. Iron Dome succeeded where it had been effective during the 2014 Gaza war, shooting down mortar shells in just 15 seconds. The Iron Dome has been quite effective, something Gaza terrorist groups didn't take into account. Significant tests with the system the military believes it passed Iron Dome batteries succeeded in shooting down at least 25 incoming projectiles over the course of the day. Israel's work continues to provide system tech improvement, streamline operating the system, mortar shells in the air for the last time Iron Dome is capable. Specifically, Iron Dome caps the escalation ladder by preventing a forced Israeli choice between intervention and passivity. Anything else results in violent interventionism, which means the counterpoint net benefit turns the case spring and Doge 11. Iron Dome successfully used it to shoot down Hamas guard rockets, would produce a defensive interceptor until Iron Dome Hamas found a great advantage in launching rockets to zero capacity because they knew free shots could jeopardize targets from more valuable than the rockets used. Defensive systems established breaks in the escalation ladder until Iron Dome Israelis faced a structure they could observe the attacker escalate by conducting retaliatory defensive operations. The enemy's escalations with the resilience of Hezbollah in 2006 to destroy enemy rocket launchers of fundamentally defensive purpose found the offensive counterstrikes to have limited effectiveness. Iron Dome provides military options to prevent an escalation. Iron Dome increases chances that protects of genuine peace. Iron Dome permits a clever distinction between itself and enemies, which side of the aggressor to argue against Iron Dome will assert the defensive system is aggressive. The argument is impossible. There one is the evidence designed to preempt this. The Flores evidence is about the importance of acknowledging solidarity and empathy with Palestinian children. We agree, nothing is incommensurate with acknowledging that they matter, but also acknowledging that needless death and missiles striking civilian targets in Israel is also a bad thing because there would suffering of innocent civilians. There's a distinction between pathologizing Palestinians as terrorists and claiming that missile attacks that do empirically happen are still bad. Next off. Regimes refers to regimes in general. The affirmative must defend that the United States ceases military into a subset of authoritarian regimes. Niebel and 14 debaters shouldn't specify plural noun phrase. It refers to more than just one. Bare plurals like determinants. Use of bare plural generic. Some say generics refer to count things rather than particular members. Vote negative for limits. They can pick over 50 authoritarian regimes, and there's no universal dissent to each reason, since each region has a different political situation that exploited by the ability to choose types of and various actors plus any combination of regimes. Topicality is a voting issue and a rule of the game. The case. On the framework, the counter role of the ballot is to evaluate the consequences of the affirmative. Their Swarovski evidence about framing Israel's actually goes negative. Framing Israel as intrinsically evil or refusing to endorse any part of it is the wrong corrective. The idea that only solution is that these people need their own state or endorsing any action regardless of the consequences, which has resulted in the violence they criticize. Swarovski 15. Institutional repression, determination, culminated horrific genocide. They believe the only solution to history was Jews to have state of their own. There's a tendency to remove the story of Israel and Palestine since it's somehow utterly unique. As things believed unessential by Jews in the Arab world, specifically extremely essential as view is you believe that Jews are exceptionally powerful to use and mention manipulate U.S. foreign policy establishment and doing wrong by the Palestinians. All of us are natural allies against the destruction of our world. Remain divided from each other. We literally can't build a unified and strong movement. We can't circle just like a fire range. We understanding our struggles connected. So powerful. The second argument on the framework is that the world exists independent of their theorization. Yes, they may have some sort of theoretical understanding of the world that's threat settler colonialism and anti-blackness, but the world is a material thing that exists outside of that. That theorization cannot 100% encapsulate the entire world, and there are obvious contingencies that we should take into account. Yep. The advantage. Plan flaw. The U.S. government doesn't consider Israel authoritarian, so the plan's specific wording, Israeli authoritarian regimes, would mean absolutely nothing because the United States thinks that Israel is a democracy. Though the very plan text is flawed and implemented by the United States, it would not work. The affirmative doesn't solve anything because their impact framing arguments will be out Israel as a whole, but ending U.S. aid doesn't stop settlement construction, violence against the Palestinians, or give the land back, which is what their evidence says is key. The military aid is not the end-all, be-all of the special relationship. We have a strong economic and diplomatic ties with green light continued Palestinian reception. And the plan strengthens the special relationships. Jacobian 16. This Jewish state with its booming economy doesn't need American charity. The U.S.-Israel alliance could be stronger if financial largesse were removed. That bounty comes with strings attached that limit Israel's freedom to make choices. For example, Israel required to spend the assistance in the United States. Money may not be used to pursue military R&D or acquire weapons in Israel itself, even though the country has domestic arms industry, but inevitably destroyed Israel's military decision-making. Dependence on U.S. aid is institutionalized in Israeli air power and even more advanced technology at the expense of focusing on more intuitively grounded maneuvers or the unique threat posed by enemies. Disentangle them from foreign aid and they'll be even stronger.
Is everybody ready?
Make sure you're talking for somebody's son. Your night.
Status of the counterplan?
It is conditional.
Okay. On the who is striking Israel in the status quo that the Iron Dome protects from?
Hezbollah, Syria, and other groups.
Why are they striking Israel?
That root cause claim inherently obfuscates the question.
It's not a root cause claim, but rather an analysis of their behavior in the status quo. I'm asking you, what is their issue with Israel, and why are they angry?
There is a complicated network of aggression by Israel and by other actors. But I think the key argument is that you may go for it is Israel's fault that these groups are striking Israel, but missiles are going to civilian population centers. If there's a child who is being killed by missiles, it is not their fault that the government has decided to be aggressive.
Okay. On the disad, your link evidence says that aid is symbolic.
Mm-hmm.
What is the implication that if aid is symbolic on the counterplan?
Aid in general, like the fact that it makes up half the budget, which is a claim a lot of Iraq make, is mostly symbolic because the weapons are being developed in the United States, and the real purpose is just to make sure that Israel understands that there's a U.S.-Israel alliance. The counterplan is about a very specific subset of aid. In the last defense budget, which was like hundreds of millions of dollars, missile defense programs were about 10 to 15 million.
I understand. On the second instance, on your Sarowski 15 evidence, can you read me a line of the card that says that we should love, can you read me a line of the card that says that things like colonial structures do not matter?
That's obviously not the case. I never made the argument that colonial structures do not matter. I think the Sarowski evidence, the wrong corrective to those colonial structures is not to reject everything and reject everything unconditionally. The Sarowski evidence actually ends with I think the very end of the article is something around the lines of everyone deserves land, everyone deserves peace, or something like that. And this evidence
Does Israel, in the world of the counterplan, does Israel deserve to exist?
The negative does not necessarily have to answer the ethical claims that do not relate to the specific results of the counterplan. If the affirmative claims that Israel doesn't deserve to, we will take the same stance that it does not matter. Well, I guess the impact framing argument is a little bit different. You've said that Israel as a nation state is illegitimate. The plan does not end Israel as a nation state, neither does the counterplan. There is a net benefit between the two.
I understand. On the plan flaw argument, sorry, not on the plan flaw argument. You didn't read the Solomon 13 card, right?
No.
On the Jacoby 16 card, what's the warrant as to why the plan strengthens a special relationship?
Yes. So right now, the United States gives aid with the requirement that that aid has to be spent in the United States. So Israel is funding companies
Which
like RT.
international actors will sell weapons to Israel?
It's not a fill-in argument. The argument that this article is making is that Israel, once it gets the restrictions cut off from the money, will literally be able to do whatever it wants with the money instead of following the current U.S. restriction, which that has to be done in the United States.
What will Israel do with the money?
They could proliferate with new offensive missile.
Why is weapons purchased from the United States comparably better than weapons purchased somewhere else?
It's not they purchase weapons, it's that they have freedom to use the aid however they want versus the restriction of the status quo.
How much did you have?
2 minutes.
Nice timing.
What?
Nice timing.
Yes. Okay, it's sent, sorry. The order is going to be T, case, counterclaim, dissent.
We're gonna do order one more.
Yes, of course. Topicality, case,
Yep.
counterclaim, dissent. Is everybody good? I meet their interpretation. Israeli authoritarian regimes are the only one in the world. They haven't read a counter-definition of authoritarian and no to it are violations. Makes their counter-interpretations of meanings impossible because their theory argument shifts in the last speech. And counter-interpretation, the act may defend the United States ought not provide military to a single regime. Prefer, one, their interpretation set up by counter ones like endless picks or tiny country disads. It means debates about specific countries are inevitable. Outweighs. Picks would steal the advantage areas of the one I see in the track. This concession which forces the app to whole res, so even if we reach specific advantage, they use strategic utility. And two, they overlimit. There will literally be only one app whole res. It's the same app every round. There's functional limits, checks, and little or solvency advocate, which their case outweighs. And the topicality is a question of what apps lie within the topic, not a contest over whether a topical claim affirms the entirety of the resolution. Nebel T is just a glorified truth-testing model, but winning plans good at affirming part of the resolution is sufficient to pursue semantics matter and pragmatics first. We don't debate to learn about grammar. We instances of the resolution to discuss topic-specific education, shifting away from real discussions about Palestinians and genocides outweighs. On case. The United States and Israel are connected by their shared founding mythology of divine entitlement to the land. The U.S. is invested in Israel's legitimacy and the external projection of its own anxiety surrounding the right to exist. The result is a special relationship that props up Israel's military regime responsible for the genocides of indigenous Palestinians. Military aid is a key component. It emboldens Israel and provides them international capital to cover their aggressive policy. This creates terrorism and instability in the area and is seen as an extension of Western influence, which answers all of their arguments about aid and symbolic and proves that the counterpoint doesn't solve. On the framing debate, first on the Soraski card, this is an affirmative card. We read this. It says that consequences must be grounded in recognition of systems like colonialism, which supercharges the explanatory power of the app thesis and proves that the root cause argument that we have to understand how terrorism is created by the United States influence. Now they say that consequences matter. We don't preclude that consequences matter, but they have to be grounded in recognition of how structures of colonialism make things like consequences inevitable, which means that makes Israel seem like an inevitable state. Now they say that they say the plan flaw argument. However, one, durable fiat solves it, and two, they've conceded that calling Israel authoritarian and important is good produces moments of things like settler discovered that shatters our normative understandings of what Israel is, which means that durable fiat solves. Now they say that there's other types of aid, but one, military aid is what emboldens Israel and sustains a special relation. It means severing military aid solves, and two, it's still a good orientation. Economic aid being bad does not make alien aid good, which means that you still. But they say that they say that there's other clauses because other countries have one. They have conceded that any fill-in has no special relationship, which means that they're not invested in Israel's legitimacy like the U.S., which explains the difference. Now they say that the plan strengthens the special relationship. However, the internal link to this argument is how the United States somehow checks it or makes Israel more ethical. And so far as they consider the Freilich evidence and the Yackley and Zunzo evidence, and the United States that permisses aggression and provides them international cover fire, which means that in the world they would no longer be emboldened. On the counterclaim text. One, it doesn't solve the affirmative. Cross-ex prove it still is recognized as Israel's right to exist, which provides them political cover fire and affirms their legitimacy, which allows them to continue intervention against Palestinians. And two, the root cause of the attacks is military aid views the countries as an extension of U.S. sovereignty, which leads to anti-Americanism and radicalism, which proves that Hamas attacks are inevitable insofar as the Iron Dome exists. That's Yackley, Morse, and the AF. And Israel's not a victim of aggressive neighbors or terrorists. It is the terrorists. Reject colonial narratives. Tarazi 09. Popular media has been told the myth that Israel is the victim. Defending against the myth has been used violence against Palestinians. Never been the victim. The fact the victim literally the Iran has been systematically 700 of their homes using colonial war criminal behaviors on accessible violence. Israel cannot be considered a victim by any stretch. And extend the Lake 14 card, which is the internal link to the dissent that says that aid is symbolic, which means that it doesn't solve the affirmative insofar as it still validates and emboldens Israel in the first place. Now the 2 hours is going to be hard. Go hard for individual people's lives matters, and the children who are taught in the crossroads of the Hamas tax lives matter. But insofar as they still provide endorsement, they've considered the Alexander card that says the United States has to refuse to endorse Israel in order to shock them and make real change, which means that it's a prerequisite to saving the people there and saving them from internal conflict is out in the first place. Now they say that it's a question of needless death and missile attacks in the status quo. However, insofar as if their plan makes those attacks inevitable and makes Israel a target inevitable, it means that the affirmative always solves. On the dissent, The internal link to this argument is that any leverage we use is used for bad, not good. Is it used for good? However, they've conceded that any leverage the United States has manipulates Israel and it lets them out the hook, which allows them to do whatever they want. That's the Yackley curve, which is an impact on their internal link. And the United States refuses to condemn Israel's action, which escalates regional conflict. Iran is poised for a terrorist attack. The app is key now. Lebanon Schwartz 1028. Israel's been conducting aggressive military campaign in the White House of potty trolls and starting to backfire. Officials will leave behind enemy support. Israel's right to self-defense is welcomes Israel's attempt to go to Iran's Iraq control the country because Iran believes the action of the Americans specifically not to attack the use of involvement in Iran orchestrated reprisal attacks Israel believed for use for Israel attacks. And Poland is highly unlikely to do not have national security threats and limited availability of fissile material. CAC 13. The general consensus has been when there's a way those with the spread of weapons has always been surprisingly slow. Weapons have been spreading slowly. Several countries developing nuclear capabilities within a decline in nuclear, and Iran has their one purpose for sake. Then the nuclear has been characterized by sharp decline in warfare. And independent of this is an instance of hostage taking, which makes Israel seem inevitable and stalls us from ever breaking away from colonial structures.
And before I start the graph, how do you spell Yackley? Because I'm kind of control F where it is.
It's this.
This one right here? Thank you. Before starting. the strikes disadvantage, topicality, the strikes disadvantage, the counter plan, the hits. Everybody ready?
No, cards.
No, sorry, these are for my reference now. Okay. My judges? Okay. Topicality not going for it, but they did make a picks bad argument hidden in one of their standards that they may try to extend. This is not offensive nor a voting issue as articulated by the 1AR. Independently, they said that their interpretation is key to checkbacks picks, which means because they specified picks are not bad and the doubt argument was not there, don't let them spin this. The disadvantage. Not going for it, but there was an impact framing argument made at the very bottom of the disadvantage that the 1AR did not answer. It said the logic of not focusing on the consequences of the affirmative in vis-a-vis everything that it interacts with is the exact same logic that they criticized. The idea that we should just endorse any action if we ethically feel good about ourselves is what resulted in the genocidal structure that they criticized, because people decided that this was a good idea, but they didn't think about the material implications for founding Israel for anyone. They didn't think about the material implications for what that would do to other people. The very logic the affirmative is purporting that we should not care about the consequences, but it's just more about the sort of general framing arguments, or we must reject in every instance, is the moral tunnel vision that resulted in what they criticized in the first place. You should look to material consequences, which will be relevant on the counterplan. The counterplan. There are 3 overview arguments you should flag on the counterplan. First is that the counterplan solves the entirety of the case. You should use sufficiency framing on this argument here. The affirmative does not end things like economic ties, even if military aid may be the strength. Their ethics argument that they will go for is just that we should not touch Israel whatsoever. The affirmative wouldn't add economic ties or other forms of cooperation, which means they don't solve that. The 1AR did not articulate how much of Israel we need to get away from in order to solve the case, and the counterplan would solve all of the material harms of the affirmative. Use a lens of sufficiency. If a counterplan solves enough of the case, then you should be able to vote on a risk of the net benefit. The second argument is the net benefit to the counterplan. This impact does matter. The 1AR does concede that consequences do matter, and you should care about civilians that are being killed. In Israel, there are strikes coming from Syria, empirically stopped by the Iron Dome, that were attacked at population centers. These strikes are a bad thing, and you should endorse systems that are able to disprove it. Even if Israel is genocidal in its logic, the only thing the counterplan maintains is a literal intrinsically defensive missile aid system that shoots down rockets that are going towards population centers and hospitals. If you think that is a bad idea because of the structures around us, you would also think that the hospitals in the United States are bad because they participate in things like settler colonialism or are structured by anti-blackness. These framing arguments do not take out the main argument that I'm making, which is that these debts do matter. The 1AR gets close where they say that Ishan will go for these arguments that you should care about the children and the innocent children being killed, and then the next line is not a response to that, but something about the way that we would still provide an endorsement. But the impact of literal innocent civilians being killed is substantially bigger on magnitude than the impact of just like maintaining a slightly larger relationship with Israel that the affirmative doesn't end. The counterplan does solve. Our evidence is much better than theirs, and if you're curious, you can read it after the round. It is all from 2018 or later. It articulates strikes that are coming from groups like Hezbollah or Syria, which also takes out their ethics framing argument because it doesn't demonize all Palestinians as terrorists. There are empirically missiles that are going to strike Israeli population centers that need to be stopped. That's what our evidence refers to. The line by line. The first argument they make is that the counterplan recognizes Israel. So does the affirmative. There are different things that you recognize, and there are other relationships that you still maintain. The argument in the 1AR for why military aid was key was a material one, so you should also look to the material argument of the 2NR, which is that this specific type of military aid literally prevents like civilian buildings from being blown up, which is obviously a net benefit. The next argument is that attacks are inevitable. The affirmative does not stop attacks. If attacks are inevitable, then you should probably have a defensive missile system that prevents them from hitting hospitals in the interim while you try to resolve the situation. The argument that Israel is not a victim, we agree that Israel is not a victim, and we are dealing with this on the framing argument, but we're just saying that we're not saying that they're not a victim. They're just saying that there are rockets that are currently being launched at civilian centers, and stopping those rockets would be a good thing. The next argument is that aid is symbolic, but this is $10 million, which is just like 0.1% of the aid we currently give them in the status quo. The 1AR solvency argument was material, so this argument does answer. The next argument is this evidence about how the Iron Dome is the Iron Dome is false. This evidence is from 2014. It is about the failures in the Gaza Strip. Our evidence explicitly answers this. It says Iron Dome failed in 2014, but restarted again. It's able to take care of mortar rockets. The last argument is that we still provide endorsement and the plan makes attacks inevitable. The counterplan makes attacks inevitable. This is obviously false. Even if the counterplan allows Israel to keep doing whatever they're doing, the plan would still have Israel exist, and Israel would keep whatever they're doing in the world of the plan. They would still have some level of military left, even if they didn't have all of the military aid, so they don't solve for that impact framing argument, and the counterplan is obviously much better than the case. The advantage. Start on the framework/root cause debate proper. 1. Their totalizing application of settler colonialism to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a bad analytic because it reduces the conflict to a simplistic narrative that papers over a history of land-based dispossession. Their Swarovski evidence calls for coming together in solidarity to try to prevent the world from being ended and try to prevent deaths. It says every life matters at the very end of the article, which means you should care about the impact of the counterplan and should not let them frame them out of debate. 2nd, there's no one root cause. They drop the argument that the world exists independent of their theorization, which means even if they theorize about the world and their theorization is good, it doesn't warrant an aft ballot because the affirmative does not solve this. Their overview argument about how military aid is key isolates material reasons why military aid is key, but the affirmative does not solve that because Israel would still have a military argument. In order to solve their ethics argument, they needed to win that Israel literally ceases to exist post-plan, which obviously is not the case. Even if they decrease it by a certain amount, maintaining this one $10 million program is not going to be much. The last argument I'm going to go for is that on the counterplan, they dropped an argument. You should cross-apply it to the case. They dropped an argument that Iron Dome caps escalation. Israel is faced within a choice. If it doesn't have a defensive missile program. If there are missile attacks on Israel, then it has to go fight them and increase offensive escalation. But my evidence particularly says Iron Dome is key to prevent them from doing that, which means the world of the plan versus the counterplan would result in more offensive escalation, which is a turn to the affirmative. You should care about people and rockets going to civilian centers. They matter. The counterplan is better than the affirmative.
The order is going to be 1AC counterplan.
I'm sorry, what are you gonna do?
1AC counterplan.
Okay. Thank you.
Is everybody ready? The ballot presents you with the choice. Should we remain complicit in the ethnic cleansing and disavowal of Palestinian sovereignty? The thesis of the app is that you should refuse to endorse every instance of support for Israel. That's the Alexander Cardone case. Only once we stand in solidarity with the victims of instability and violence and align ourselves with justice can we broaden the horizon for peace, freedom, and liberation. Ishan wants you to buy into a narrative of its inevitability, and it does that our hands must be kept dirty and that supporting Israel is an imperative or else we risk real consequences. This mirrors our real-world unwillingness to confront our own relation and the continual investment in the way that we continue to justifications for Israeli Palestinian populations. Now, there's two questions on the case debate which will make you squarely affirm. First is the question whether or not consequences matter. The 1AR does not disagree that consequences matter, but just that they must be understood through a lens of colonialism in a world that makes things like structural violence exist. Insofar as we recognize and ground our analysis of consequences in this starting point, it's the only way to broaden the horizon. This hijacks all their consequentialism arguments because it assumes that consequences do matter, but just that we must start them and ground them in an understanding of how things like structural violence exist, which also answers all of their arguments about how we exist in moral tunnel vision because it is the opposite of moral tunnel vision, because it rectifies that certain injustices are written into the way that we understand the world. Now, second is the argument of things like economic aid as terminal defense for the case. They have conceded that it does not matter if the United States is continuing to give economic aid insofar as that military aid is what emboldens Israel. That is the Yackley and Freilich evidence that Israel enjoys a de facto United States security guarantee which allows them to pursue aggressive policies. In the world of the counterplan, this does not change. All of their solvency arguments prove that Israel still feels protected by the United States, which allows them to pursue things like aggressive policies, which means that their escalation impacts is inevitable in the world of the counterplan and turns all the terminal impact. It also means that the counterplan doesn't solve the terminal impact to the 1AC because it is a question of whether or not we orient ourselves away from Israel. Now, they say that it leads to escalation, but insofar as we're winning this argument, it's a reason as to why the de facto security guarantee allows them to continue to be emboldened and pursue aggressive policies and engage in things like ethnic cleansing on the counterplan. There are two major arguments that will win me this debate. First is the question of the pro-Israel lobby. They have conceded my evidence that says that Israel exaggerates the success of the Iron Dome program. It's not a historical analysis or material analysis, but rather that pro-Israel scholars and writers always exaggerate the success of the Iron Dome in order to continue the fortification of the United States' relationship with Israel, which the counterplan is an instantiation of. And then second, they've conceded that the root cause of things like attacks are Western influence, i.e. the tangible presence of the United States in Israel is what causes radicalization and anti-Americanism, which means that in the world of the counterplan, strikes continue because there's a tangible and physical reference of United States influence in Israel. And even if there's economic influence in the world post the affirmative, it doesn't have the same physical infrastructure which is the accident as to why we get access to root cause framing. The debate breaks down pretty simply. The 1AC is a question of whether or not we should remain complicit in genocide. It does not disavow consequences, but rather that our understanding of consequences must be grounded with analysis of colonialism, how it works. They have conceded that providing Israel a de facto security guarantee allows them to pursue aggressive policies, which make things like violence, ethnic cleansing, and genocide inevitable, and is the root cause of the conflict in the first place. They've also conceded that the United States' presence in Israel is what radicalizes groups around them and causes things like insurgency in the first place, which means that you should vote AF to end the conflict and disavow yourself with the type of genocide that happens in Israel.
Can you send it to Scott? Yes, sir. Because he wanted a